want to welcome you to our meeting today of the House Special Committee on Election Integrity. Um, if you would, as we always do, bow your heads with me and we'll begin our meeting with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you now for the opportunity to come together as this committee. We ask you to give us the wisdom in this room, as always, to do what is best for the people of our great state. Bless us and keep us as we move forward. We pause also, Lord, to remember all of those suffering from the effects of this pandemic. We ask that your healing hands not only be upon them, but also with those who are ministering to them and caring for them. Bless us and keep us now as we move forward. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you being here today. There are a couple of bills on the agenda. The one I intend to focus on today is House Bill 531, which you should have a copy in front of you, and I'll read the LC number to make sure we're all working off the same one. LC 280215. LC 280215. This will be the first of more than one hearing, I suspect, on this measure. Today, my goal was to talk to you about it and allow committee input and questions, and also, if time allows, maybe a few witnesses. You should be getting a notice that we will be scheduled to meet tomorrow. I think the starting time is 9 or 9:30. I'm not sure, but that should be coming to you, and we'll have more opportunity for discussion tomorrow as well. But as far as a way of introduction to the bill that you have in front of you, let me begin by talking just briefly about this whole process of our looking at the election laws in Georgia. If you have been following at all the issue of elections in the state of Georgia, you know that there has been controversy regarding our election system. And I believe the goal of our process here should be an attempt to restore the confidence of our public in our election system. There are obviously, I think, things that need to be done. We never designed an election system, I don't think, for a pandemic, but we certainly had to learn how to run one during that time period. The election issues did not start in 2020, however. In 2018, we had another general election, the last one before this most recent one. And in that election, we saw a good bit of controversy about the election process and many people questioning it. It just so happened that the questions at that time seemed to come from the left side of the aisle. I think the candidate for governor who lost that race, I'm not sure if that concession was ever made. And occasionally in the media, I hear that person referred to as governor, just highlighting the amount of doubt from certain segments of the public in our election system. When you fast forward to 2020, I guess you would say the shoe seemed to be on the other foot. There seemed to be many people from the right side of the aisle questioning our election system. So the goal of the bill that you have in front of you today that we will begin to discuss is to an attempt, to the extent that we can, begin to try to remedy some of those problems and try to bring the left and the right back to a position where they have confidence overall in our election system. The This last election, and a large part of this bill, does focus on the absentee balloting process. Normally, in Georgia elections prior to this 2020 election, probably less than 5%, maybe 3%, 4% of our balloting was done through an absentee balloting process, people voting that way. Most people voted in person, whether it be early or day of voting, as we refer to it. This past election, depending on whether you look at the primary or the runoff or the general, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 or more of our voters voted in the absentee balloting form. There was significant discussion, controversy, consternation with parts of that process, particularly the signature verification process. And one thing that you will see that this bill does is it attempts to move from what is a subjective process, that being signature, to an objective process of using a number, which most Georgians have, by and far have, 97%, I think, a driver's license number. Let that be the center of our verification process for absentee ballots. Not only are there portions of this bill that deal with the absentee ballot, but also many other areas of the voting process. I think one thing we have to keep in mind for the people who actually run elections in Georgia, we have to make sure that our laws reflect a system that make it efficient for them to run the system. When you have a system, however, whatever kind it is, and you have voting going on, counting of votes going on for days after the election, particularly in the wee hours of the morning sometimes. Your mother probably told you when you were a young kid, there's not too much good that happens after midnight. And the more we can make this process work for our election officials, get those tabulations done on election night and out to the voting public, I think the confidence will be built back into our system, and you will see there are portions of this bill that attempt to accomplish that. So what I would like to do as we start now is to take you through the different sections of the bill that deal with these different issues, point them out to you. And of course, after that process, I'd be happy for members of the committee to ask questions or make comments on any of those. I would ask you to keep your notes on any comments that you want to make about any particular section as we walk through it, because I'll go through it once and then come back to you with any comments or questions that you have. And then, time allowing, we will try to, if possible, hear from a few witnesses today. So, as I mentioned to you, one of the main thrusts of the bill is to restore the efficiency and the confidence in our absentee balloting process. If you will look in these sections, and I'll name them for you, we will have a discussion about, I'll lead you through some of the portions that deal with the absentee balloting process. Most of the absentee ballot changes take place in Section 8, Section 10, Section 11, and Section 13 of the bill. If you look in Section 8 of the bill, that is where we begin to deal with the absentee ballot application process. One of the changes that we hope to affect in the bill is the envelope that is used for the absentee ballot process. That is in Section 10 of the bill. Section 11 of the bill addresses how the absentee ballot envelope is filled out and returned. Section 13 of the bill, if you flip over to that, deals with how the county deals with the return envelope. And also, if there is a problem, we address there the chance to resolve that problem, or sometimes referred to as the ability to cure the absentee ballots. One of the other things that we deal with in the bill is the timelines for the absentee ballot process. But before I get to that, I want to talk about how we change from a subjective system to what I would believe is a objective system. Probably the best way to talk about that is to look at a driver's license itself. If I were to ask one of you to open your wallet and pull out your driver's license, it would be very similar to the situation where you go to vote now in person. If you go to vote in person, you're going to show the election worker your driver's license. They're going to do a couple of things when you walk in. They're going to take your driver's license. They're going to look at the photo on your driver's license, and then they're going to look at you. And they're going to first check to see if the picture looks the same. Very understandable process. Then they likely, in many counties, will take it and they'll scan your driver's license because it does have coded information on it. And the key to that is getting your driver's license number off of that. That's the process that we're all very familiar with when you go in and you vote in person. Now, if you think about the absentee ballot process, right now, when you send in an absentee ballot, a piece of paper, an absentee ballot application, a piece of paper, you, as has been discussed in some areas, if we required you to send in a photocopy of your absentee ballot, of your driver's license, then the piece of paper comes in, which is the photocopy, and the election worker opens it and they look at it, your picture, but there's one component missing there. You're not there for them to compare that picture to. So sending in a photocopy of your driver's license or state ID card for voting with your photo on it does not serve the same purpose as it would if you were voting in person. So there is, though, something that would provide, I believe, and the bill goes in this direction, a good, almost PIN number that is unique to you, and that is your driver's license number. If you go into a room of 100 folks and you ask them, those that know their driver's license number by heart, to raise their hand, you'll probably find, in my experience, maybe 2, maybe 3 people will know that. Most people don't know their driver's license number, unlike their social security number. They don't know their driver's license number because you never use your driver's license like you do other numbers. You never use your driver's license number like you do other numbers like your social security number. Because of that, you and I very seldom put our driver's license number down for anything, particularly on the internet. That means that for someone to steal your driver's license number, in other words, this unique PIN number that identifies you, they pretty much have to, in my case, get in your back pocket. They have to get into your billfold where most people keep it. Now, if they're able to do that, not only could they steal your driver's license and your PIN number and possibly vote for you, but they're going to get your credit cards and they're going to get you cash and whatever else you have there. So one of the most secure ways this bill anticipates to make sure you are who you say you are is to ask for a number which is very unique to you and also is likely not easily stolen by somebody else. Right now, in our elections process, the way we do that verification, as has been mentioned, is by signature. Replacing it with this driver's license number is, I believe, and the bill follows this, a step in the right direction to secure it with something that is very accessible by you, but not necessarily accessible by someone else. So you will find as you work through the bill and we talk about the bill that main component of it is very important. Let me also mention that about 97% of Georgians are identified in our voting records by either their driver's license or a state-issued identification card. So our system of county by county identification of who is registered properly and who is not is in very many cases tied to that number, which makes it another very good number for us to use. Let me move on past that portion of the bill and talk about the issue I touched on a second ago, and that is the timelines for absentee ballots. There are pretty much three ways that the bill addresses this issue of absentee ballot timelines. The first one is setting the beginning time for when you can send in your absentee ballot application. One thing about our absentee ballot application laws is that they're almost 6 months now, long before the election is going to occur. For voter clarity and also for making the process simply work better for our people working, trying to issue absentee ballots, the bill moves that 6-month deadline to 78 days so that the actual applications will be coming in closer to the election process. Um, Also, as has been discussed in this committee previously in House Bill 270, a bill that has already passed out of this committee, in Section 8 of the bill, where we address the application, um, uh, the beginning of the application process, also we address when absentee ballot applications can be turned in. Currently, as this committee is aware of in previous testimony, absentee ballots applications can be turned in as late as the Friday before the election. And as you heard in this room testimony from the Houston County Elections Director, you probably have a very slim chance, if you wait to that Friday and apply for an absentee ballot, of getting it back in time. So in Section 8 of the bill, we incorporate portions of language from House Bill 270, which moves that to the second Friday before the election. Also in the bill is the guidelines that were put in House Bill 270, whereby election directors have 3 days after that deadline to get your absentee ballot out and to you. Also, in Section 10 of the bill, we change the time when absentee ballots will be absentee ballots themselves will be sent out to those requesting them. Currently, the law was between 49 and 45 days before the election that those absentee ballots will be sent out. This bill in Section 10 changes that to 29 to 25 days before the election for those to be sent out. The idea here is that it probably makes more sense for us to have one voting period. This puts the mailing of the absentee ballots very similar, very close to the same period of voting as we have for early voting. That puts our public in the mindset that voting begins about this time, whether it be early or absentee ballot, however you choose, and then, of course, culminates on election day. Now, I want to move away from absentee ballots to some other issues now that are addressed in the bill. If you look in Section 9 of the bill, this is where we address the issue, sometimes controversial issue, of drop boxes. House Bill 531 makes some changes to when and how drop boxes can be used. The bill requires that all drop boxes shall be located inside an early voting site, that the drop boxes will be open for people to deposit into them the same hours as the early voting site. Also, that it be monitored by election officials and that it be emptied each night. There are several reasons for this. Part of the perception in the public about the problems with drop boxes is that anything could be put in them at any time of the night. This changes that. I also have concerns in the future about drop boxes, possibly if they're not in secure places, becoming targets. We do know in this last election, not in Georgia, but in other states, there was a drop box destroyed by, the contents destroyed by fire. Another benefit of having set hours for these drop boxes is that one of the things we are trying to do in this bill is make this election process even more workable for our election workers. to get ballots counted on time, to get them reported promptly. Having the drop boxes in early voting locations and keeping the same hours and having them emptied each night allows those absentee ballots to be gotten back to the election headquarters where they can go ahead and be processed. And you'll see us addressing that in other portions of the bill. Now, if you'll flip over to section 12 of the bill, this is where we address uniformity in voting times. I've heard people refer to conversations before, whereas you may live in one county and work in another, and two folks start discussing when they're going to vote. And somebody says, well, I'm going to vote on this day. And they say, you can't vote on that day. There's no early voting on that day. And all of a sudden, you've got confusion between two people about when they can or cannot vote because they live in two different counties. House Bill 531 brings uniformity to the times for early voting. It does not change the fact that we have 3 weeks, but it does set, as the original intent of the legislation was, but it probably was not written best, and therefore there's ambiguity in it. It does set that the day for weekend voting will be the second Saturday of early voting. That was the original intent of the law. And then it sets standardized hours with some flexibility for the times early voting precincts can be open. No less than 9 to 5 across the state and no more than 7 to 7. So you have some consistency on the days early and hours where early voting will take place across the state. Now turning to the issue in section 13 of the bill of early scanning or early processing. Most of you may remember that in this past election, because of the overwhelming crush of absentee ballots that were received, the State Board of Elections actually set out emergency rules regarding when votes had to be processed. This bill follows part of that logic and says that counties may, by the second week in early voting, they're authorized to begin the processing of absentee ballots if they want to. In other words, not tabulating them, not counting them, but opening them, verifying the identification through the driver's license number, and also getting them ready to scan and scanning them. They can begin that by the second week of early voting. They have to begin that by the third week in early voting, mandated across the state. If you'll now turn to section 19 of the bill, this is where we deal with an issue that got a lot of attention this past year of something that's referred to as the jungle primary. This bill would significantly curtail and eliminate in most instances this idea of having a jungle primary in Georgia or a primary where you have, and I think in this last Senate race, wasn't it almost 20 names on the ballot? I know that I heard stories from some places, and I'm sure it happened more than we know about. People knew that there were 2 senators being elected, and they would sometimes vote for 2 people in that jungle primary list, which actually spoiled their ballot for that race, and their vote would not be counted. What the bill does is it eliminates jungle primaries except in the 2 situations where a seat could not be filled by appointment. Those 2 areas are the General Assembly and Congress. The law currently does not allow for the appointment of a congressman or a member of the General Assembly. Now, the situation that we're trying to avoid there for the General Assembly is a good example. We're only in session 40 days, usually part of January, most of February, and most of March, and our session is over with. And if you look at current Georgia law, you will see that the governor almost has to call a snap election when we're in session or close to being in session so that a seat does not remain vacant during the General Assembly, or as much as possible does not remain vacant. If it's outside of the General Assembly session, there's a longer period allowed for that seat to be filled. So the only 2 places that we keep jungle primaries and don't go to the normal primary and runoff system that we have are for the General Assembly and for Congress, because under the law, there is no other way to fill those seats. Even if you go down to the county level, whether it be a constitutional officer like a sheriff or a probate judge, there are provisions in place to fill that seat until the next general election where that person will have to run or people can qualify to be run. But that's not the case with the General Assembly in Congress. If you now turn over to Section 10 of the bill, we'll discuss the runoff periods in Georgia. As most of you know, traditionally in Georgia, we had a 4-week period for runoffs. The intention of the language in Section 10 is to return us back to that 4-week period for runoffs, not the 9 weeks that currently exist in Georgia. How we got from 4 weeks under Georgia law to a 9-week runoff instead deals with our ability to get our overseas military ballots back into Georgia because of our runoff system. A federal judge ruled that we had to stretch that out to 9 weeks for our runoff in order to get those ballots back. There are 3 other states that I'm aware of that have runoffs also. They're Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina. And they use some form of what is commonly referred to as a ranked choice voting system. And here's what that means. If you're overseas and you receive your ballot, you'll receive the same ballot that everybody else does back in the States, back home. You'll be able to vote for who you want to vote for. But if there's a possibility of a runoff in one of those races, you will receive a second ballot that I'll refer to as the ranked choice voting ballot. You also fill that out. In other words, you get to pick your second, third, and possibly fourth choice, or how many there ever are in the race, of who you would vote for if a runoff occurred. Both of those ballots are then returned. And instead of us having to send you a ballot for a runoff back overseas again, thus triggering that 9-week runoff period, we now go back to a 4-week runoff period, and we already have your vote because of that second ballot that we sent you initially. I've heard someone refer to this as the giving people back their Christmas portion of the bill, because I don't think any of our citizens, or at least not too many of them, like the fact that we just experienced elections during Christmas time. And if we can get this back to a 4-week runoff, we can avoid that. As with any large bill, there's some clarifying language that we'll insert at a later time to accomplish what I said in Section 10, an addition that I caught just a little bit earlier. Now I want to talk about the issue of the inspection of voting machines that we use in Georgia. If you'll go to Section 7 of your bill, we deal with there the issue of additional transparency for the inspection of the voting machines that we use in our state. Currently under Georgia law, there are provisions for the public, the parties, the press to be able to participate in that inspection process. However, Section 7 of the bill attempts to highlight that, magnify it, and increase the visibility of that process. So members of the public, members of the press, members of the parties will know exactly when, where, and how they can participate in this all-important process of inspection, testing of the voting machines before our elections occur. If you'll now move over to Section 14 of the bill, Section 14 of the bill deals with the ensuring sufficient access to poll watchers in tabulation centers. One controversy that was discussed, one point of contention was discussed in this last election, was whether or not poll watchers could actually watch the actual process of tabulation that was going on. Section 14 of the bill attempts to clarify that and make sure that sufficient access occurs. Along those lines, if you'll now turn over to stay in Section 14 rather of the bill, for the first time in Georgia, we're going to require training for poll watchers. If you are a poll watcher, but you've never had the ability to watch the elections process, you may not be quite as familiar with what you see. It would help, we believe, for there to be some training that takes place prior to that, so that you will have better knowledge of what you're watching, possibly be able to ask better questions, be better assistance to the process. That's in Section 14 of the bill. Another portion of the bill, if you turn now to Section 6 of the bill, this is another portion of the bill that tries to help our local officials run a more efficient um, and and um, and appropriate process for the elections. Right now in Georgia law, there is one voting machine required at a precinct per 250 voters. This provision does not change that for the large general elections that we have, but for other elections, particularly special elections, after an analysis, the superintendent may decide that because the turnout will be very low, that they don't have to have that same number of machines per voter as they would have to in the general election. If you've ever watched the elections process, there's a significant amount of work, time, and effort that goes into on behalf of the poll workers to unpack the machines. They have to be properly stored, to test the machines, which we've already discussed. And then afterwards, they have to be repacked and stored properly. There's a sufficient amount of wear and tear that goes into it every time that you have to do that, and a lot of time taken up by election workers. We want to make sure that if you unpack 10 machines, it's because an analysis has been done, particularly in a smaller special election, that's how many will be needed. Not that you unpacked 50 and you wasted a lot of time and put the machines through more wear and tear. So that section of the bill, Section 6, addresses the number of machines per precinct, but does not change it for general elections. If you move to Section 4 of the bill, this is where we address the issue of long lines. The best method of voting, in my opinion, in Georgia, and of course the rest of the General Assembly and members of this committee will have their chance to give their opinion as well, is in-person voting. When you are inside the confines of the voting precinct, the chances for any undue influence on you casting your ballot is pretty low. With that in mind, we need to make sure that if you go to vote in person, that the lines are not unmanageable. In other words, the lines aren't too long. Section 4 of the bill attempts to address that. It's what I will call the no long lines in general elections portion, if you will. It basically says that if after monitoring, which is required by the poll workers, lines are more than 1 hour for people to wait to get to vote, that there must be an analysis done by the election superintendent of doing something to decrease those long lines for the next election. Those are, if you have over 2,000 voters, maybe you need to split that precinct, or maybe more machines need to be at that precinct the next time, or maybe the need is for more poll workers. Whatever the cause and whatever the cure for those long lines, that part of the bill begins to put in place a process to address that. If you move to Section 16 of the bill, there is another portion of the bill which attempts to address this issue of potential long lines, and also the ability of the voting and election officials, rather, to curtail problems and delays in our system. One of the problems that we have seen that has become more significant in recent elections is people not voting in the proper precinct. If you don't go to the proper precinct in Georgia and have to vote a provisional ballot, you do a couple of things. The first thing that's most important to me, if you're voting in the wrong precinct by provisional ballot, you may get to have your vote count at the top of the ticket, whether it be governor or president or senator, or maybe even congressman. But you very likely may not have your vote count because you're at the wrong precinct, because you're not in your county commission district. You're not in your state house or state senate district. So having people vote out of precinct not only causes that problem, but it causes a second problem. One of the things that is most time consuming for our election officials is the processing of provisional ballots. Because when somebody votes a provisional ballot, it has to be investigated to make sure that they indeed were a registered voter. There was a problem when you vote a provisional ballot. It also has to literally be transferred. The votes have to be transferred from it to another ballot that can actually be scanned. One of the things that is probably not comforting, particularly for citizens who see it on TV and don't understand that sometimes you have to do that, is a lot of that going on. This transferring from provisional ballots to ballots that can be scanned is something that should be avoided if we can. And Section 16 of the bill takes a step in that direction. I should also mention before we move on to the next portion, if you're in the line and you are in the wrong precinct, it causes probably a delay when you get up to the front. Now you've stood in line, and it takes time for the poll worker who's trying to check other voters in to stop and deal with you because you're in the wrong place, and also because they have to get you a provisional ballot. If you will now move over to Section 17 of the bill. This is a new addition to Georgia law that will deal with how duplication panels are made up. Although we would like to limit provisional ballots to as few as necessary, there are times when people have to vote provisional for one reason or another, and there is a process that I just referenced of duplicating that provisional ballot, taking the votes on that provisional ballot, transferring them over to a normal ballot, which can be scanned and counted through the system. Currently, that process under Georgia law is done by two election officials. In Section 17 of the bill, we'll adopt something that I have heard referred to as a Texas model, where one appointee from the Democratic Party, one appointee from the Republican Party, and one election official will actually now carry out that process. So you've got more transparency in the process and more representation from the most likely interested parties. So the questioning of that process hopefully is decreased and the confidence is increased. If you turn back to Section 1 of the bill, Section 1 deals with what has sometimes been referred to as private money or sometimes dark money in funding public elections. What Section 1 does is it says that public money will be used to fund public elections, not private money, and it eliminates this private or dark money coming into the election superintendent to fund the election process. If you now look over in Section 5 of the bill, this deals with the part of our law which deals with the emergency process for what do you do if a precinct is somehow disabled prior to the election. The thought process under the original portion of Georgia law that deals with this, I believe, went to the idea, what if a tornado or hurricane hit in a particular area, and you literally needed to bring in mobile units to have people vote. This makes it clear that if you have a mobile voting unit like a bus or something along those lines, it will be because there's an emergency situation, not just that you are choosing to basically open a new voting precinct anywhere you want to in the county. There's a reason why we require voting precincts to be determined beforehand so people will know where they are, so confidence is in the system of where those precincts exist. If you now turn over to Section 18 of the bill, Section 18 of the bill, this is another adjustment that we're making to help with what I would refer to as our confidence in the system. An important part of this last election, in my opinion, was the audit that occurred. When the legislature gave permission for new voting machines to be bought in Georgia, we instituted for the first time a required audit. In other words, a very close look and count of the ballots that were voted to make sure that they lined up with the actual results that were given to us by the scanning process of the voting machines. In order to have a viable and good audit to build that confidence in the results, you need to have time to do that. In an earlier version of changes to Georgia law, we actually moved the certification date for local officials to the back from the date that it was, and that was the Monday after the election. we moved it further out. What we have found now is that in order for you to have a good audit, a confidence building audit for the public, you need to go ahead and get that certification done, see what the numbers are, and then begin the audit process. So what Section 18 of the bill does is simply move the certification deadline back to the Monday after the election where it was for many years. Section 2 of the bill allows for out of county poll workers. One thing that was told to us by some of our counties is that, particularly during this pandemic, they had trouble getting enough workers for the polls. One of the solutions that was proposed is to adjust Georgia law so that you did not have to live in the county where you actually worked at the polls. A good example of how this makes sense is if you live and work in one county and go to church in another county. If you go to church in the county next door to you, that church may very well be a voting precinct, as we're quite well aware of. If you're familiar with there and you want to volunteer to work at that precinct, your own church, why shouldn't you be able to do that just because you don't live in the county where your church is? So what this does is make an adjustment to Georgia law to begin to address that. If you if you live in an adjoining county, you would be allowed to work in the county next door as a poll worker. And we think that that will begin to address more flexibility for our election officials as they move through the election process. Members of the committee, what I wanted to do there is just give you a brief overview of the bill. What I wanted to do there is just give you a brief overview of the bill and walk through some of the thought processes behind the changes that are there. At this time, what I want to do is open it up to committee members. If they have any questions about any of the sections that we talked about or want to go back and discuss some of them further, the chair would entertain questions from any members of the committee. Representative Deloach, are you number 15? Yes, sir.
My question is about what would appear to be an advantage by emptying those drop boxes at the end of every day. My understanding is when a ballot comes in by absentee ballot comes in by mail, that is indicated on the Secretary of State's website the very next day, so you can look on there and tell your ballot has been received and have confidence your ballot's going to get counted. I would assume if they empty these drop boxes every day, they could go through the same process. So you look on that website and you know your ballot's there and it's going to get counted. Is that correct?
That's part of the thought process of improving that. Yes. If they're emptied daily, if there are set hours of when they will be open, if the early voting precinct has closed, the workers will be exiting there anyway. Part of their wrap-up duties, I guess you would say, would be to empty that, get those to the Board of Elections where they could be properly processed and entered into the system that you just referenced. Yes, sir. Other questions from members of the committee? Ms. Burnough, what number are you? It should be on you're number 9. Press the, no. Right in front of you, press that one. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it is. Just don't press it again. All right. Now try. Bring the mic. No. All right. Press it one more time. Now don't touch it. Just pull the mic to you and see if it works. There you go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the explanation of the bill that you and the other signers wrote. None of the Democrats had anything to say on it. And I just thought that at the beginning of this committee, special election on integrity, that we would have been involved in the process. This is a very large bill, 48 pages, that the public or people of color, they didn't have opportunity to review or to give an opinion. And there's a lot of information in here that needs to be digested and looked at. But one of the things that I learned is that I look at absentee ballot like I look at Zoom. Most of us didn't know how to use it during the pandemic, but once they were able to use both, they learned to appreciate the convenience. And so I think that instead of us making it more difficult for the process for absentee ballots and the drop boxes and other methods of not allowing Sunday voting, when our Secretary of State said that there were no problems, I think if we're trying to really work towards restoring confidence, that we should be working towards improving everything based on suggestions from the entire state of Georgia, not just us down here in the General Assembly, but actually going and talking to people, because I don't know that you've talked to any other election officials in different counties except for the lady that was here a couple weeks ago. So I was just wondering how this bill kind of came about, because there's a whole lot in there.
Well, thank you for those several questions, Representative Burnough. Let me see if I can address some of them. First of all, this is the first hearing on this bill. As you are familiar with, because you've been down here a while, quite often with large issues, we have several hearings. We will have more than one hearing on this bill. So any questions or comments or inputs that you want to make or amendments, you're certainly welcome to do that through the process. I have spoken with other election officials besides those that have testified in this hearing. Actually been doing that for a couple of years now. I've also spoken with many of my constituents and other Georgians, taken numerous phone calls, read thousands, it seems, of emails, read other commentary on the elections process. So I didn't begin to think about this or work on this just in the past few weeks while we've been here in session. This has been a long time in the process. Um, um, I did try to take all those things that I had learned and put them into a bill after I discussed with other members of the legislature, particularly. Did try to put into this bill things that would help the election system work better and help build confidence in our system, from where we've had, as I mentioned, 2 general elections in a row where first one side seemed to question the system greatly and then the other. So um, that would be the response I would give you to the things I can remember that you said.
Thank you.
And now if I didn't touch on something and you want to repeat it, I'll give it a shot.
No, that's all for right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Miss Alexander, did you want to speak? Representative Alexander?
I mean, for whatever reason, my light is not on. I haven't.
So here's part of the confusion. As we have spaced out for social distancing, the number that appears on my screen here is the one that is on the plastic notice right there below all your paper. That's why you're not looking at it. But I've got you, and you go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will try not to repeat some of the things that the previous representative did. For me, it feels like it's a rush to push this through. I believe it was a first read and couldn't find the bill online. Finally did find that online. So I guess voting for me is an interest to everyone, and specifically in my district, like I know it is in the whole 159 counties. Is very important. There is a lot to digest in this bill. It is huge. I am just now looking at it for the first time. So if I'm just not looking at it for the first time, the concern is having the input from the people in the community. And I know you mentioned that you want to have another hearing in the morning. Is that going to be enough time for people? Why not Monday? Considering the fact that we're just now receiving this bill. Or would you consider Monday instead of you said tomorrow?
Sure. What I think we'll do is we'll see how tomorrow's hearing goes, and then we'll make a decision about Monday tomorrow. Were there any other questions, Representative Alexander, that you had?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from any members of the committee? Chairman Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a comment as a member of this special committee. I know the legislative process and I know what we've been going through. The protocol that we've dealt with during this session has been unusual, to say the very least. It's hard to get bills drafted. It's hard because of the pressure and inundation of not having actual contact, physical contact with our lead counsel. And I heard the questions that were answered, and I have my own concerns. I have been on record of saying that I'll defend anybody's right to vote, whether they for me or against me. But that being said, I'm also one that believes that we have a problem with our process. In 2018, voter suppression was the key word at that time. And I took offense to that because at that point, I saw some major problems that voter suppression was being used as a buzzword, but yet local counties were in charge of their own elections. And the problems that were spoke of at that time on voter suppression was really focused at the counties where the party at that time had control of those counties. So I saw some of the problems of the process. We have an interesting system, to say the very least, about how the process works. And I understand what we've got in this document here today. These are comments that have come from constituents. They came from boards of elections. They've came from membership of the legislature. We have another body, the lower body called the Senate, and they're churning stuff out. And I'm not quite sure how much of that has been perfected over there, whatever it is that they're doing. But in this process, we're going to be going through this, as I presume that we generally do with the committee. We'll be here tomorrow, and I think that's going to be a long haul tomorrow. And I'm sure that we'll have other days because there's going to be things that's going to be added into this bill. One of the requests that I'd like to make, and I knew that this was an interesting style of going from section to section just to hit the high points for the benefit of the committee. But I would like for these other folks, whether it be boards of elections or the state elections folks, to be here tomorrow to give us a description. When we see the technical language, it looks to me like we've probably hit on 10 or 12 the minor points. And the death is in the details about how we perfect this legislation. But I'd like for them to be in attendance tomorrow to give us a walkthrough of how these are going to affect us. When we're talking about the local boards of election, how are we going to make it easier for them? How are we going to make it so that they can be absolutely sure that we're securing a vote? Nobody that I know of wants to suppress any vote or to disenfranchise anybody. But one of the other sides of that coin is that we want to be sure that we have a process that is absolutely working, that there's no collusion, there's nothing that's wrong. We know that we have two different Georgias. We've got part of Georgia that's smaller, less population. They're easier to handle. And then we have the metro areas that are inundated with votes. We know that in rural Georgia that we get our cackles up sometimes whenever we perceive things that aren't being done right. Like when a judge can order that a metro precinct can run to 10 o'clock at night, but yet we're shutting down at 7 o'clock because somebody forgot to bring a power cord. That's not our fault in rural Georgia. And I've talked about uniformity, and that's something that I would truly like to see so that we have no questions about the process itself. But tomorrow I'd like to see possibly the walkthrough. How will these absentees be processed? Clearly, what are we going to do? The buses. One of the things that was absolutely dismaying to me, because I had told folks that voting by buses, roving buses, was not legal, because in my 32 years here, I've always understood that polling places were supposed to be locked to where they were. And then we find out that there was a little hole that was used by the folks in the metro area. A lot of us had concerns about money being donated are given in the form of grants to some counties so that they could buy this equipment or that equipment. Well, there's something that doesn't seem quite right to me in that what makes one county more important than my home counties, where the taxpayers cover that cost. And I saw where that's covered in here. But there's so many minuscule details that we need to go through this to be sure. And the two most important things is that while we work on the process, to make this process easier to operate for the benefit of those election boards, we also need to work on to be sure in this document or whatever document comes out that there's a couple of issues that's dealt with. One, it was the issues of the absentees, to be sure that there's honesty and validity to that to solve anybody's question. And second, to the machines themselves, to be sure that if we're going to continue to use $100 million investment, that these machines are very valid and to show through the auditing process and things. So that being said, if these folks could be here tomorrow to talk to us and to address this issue so that we can carry this on through, and hopefully maybe we can find a common ground across the board, because what's in the benefit of one political party should be in the benefit of the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those lines of, as you discussed, as I discussed, and I think you referenced, trying to build confidence in the system and in problems. There are many details in the bill, more of which we will discuss. For example, in section 15 of the bill, we deal with the issue of making sure that everybody inside the boundaries of the voting precinct are there to vote. We know that you're not supposed to campaign inside those boundaries, but you also shouldn't be there if you're passing out items or doing other things. Of course, what you do away from the polling precinct, whether it be campaigning or passing out items, is fine. But our attempt is, when you get close to the polls, that it be a secure area where just voting is going on. Let's see, we do have some other comments. Number 7 is Representative Douglas.
Thank you, Chairman. And it's a whole lot to kind of put down and chew on. But as I look at the bill and I see the names across the front of the bill, I see no Democratic bill names on here. So one of my questions I'm going to start off by saying, was there any Democratic input into this thesis of a bill?
Yes.
There was some Democratic input. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I see that you did take my suggestion of trying to put everything in one bill.
You did ask that that
Yes.
be done. I took it seriously.
I love that part. But I was trying to locate it so I can do my research, and wasn't able to find it. And to some of the comments that was made while we're here, to bring people in to give each side of the story, because like they always say, you have one side of the story, you have the other side, and there's somewhere in the middle, there's the truth. And so since everything is packed in here so tight, and it wasn't verbatim where you went from, 1 all the way to 18 or 19 or 20, whatever it is, sections, we had to jump over, back and forth. And so I couldn't really stay on point with those things that were added. And I need a little bit more time to dig into it. But we must keep in mind, and I'm gonna say this and understand my heart and where I'm coming from. And I heard the comments about, the election before, but that was a more of an integrity standpoint than anything else, where you can hold a position in one area that oversees the area which you're trying to run. So that was more about integrity than anything else. This last election was unprecedented. Nobody expected us to have or being a pandemic. And so there are some changes that need to be made, but we also have to consider that it has to be monetary changes to go along with that. And so if you're going to change everything and don't add the money to add those resources, we still shortchange the whole process. Because if we're going to change everything in our election system like that's packed in this bill, there has to be some type of monetary compensation so each county, big or small, can be able to run efficiently on the resources that it has or needs at that particular time. And so there were several comments made and from our leadership in our state, which were saying there was the most secure and ran election system. Of course, we're going to have some hiccups every now and then. It was a new system. So we're going to have hiccups getting through that new system. But just don't tear down everything that went well, trying to add something that we don't know that's going to work at all. And I'm interested to see where this bill comes from here. I would like to have time, because it's a very packed bill, to get all of our ducks in a row and call parties on both sides of the aisle, so both sides can make their adequate entities toward perfecting a decent bill to get out in front of the people so we can be efficient and just not wasting people's time. And they're not way on one side heavy or on the other side heavy. It can be right there in that sweet spot in the middle. So those are my concerns going forward. But thank you for allowing me to speak.
Yes, sir, Representative. Thank you. Mike, 21. I think no, she's 9. 21. Okay. We'll go to anybody over here? Okay. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I think it was 1999, I got a call from the chief judge asking me to be a chief registrar in Baldwin County. And I barely didn't even really know what a registrar was, much less the chief registrar. But I got the election code book, and for 16 years I served in that capacity, and meeting election officials all over Georgia, and registrars and election officials. They're a dedicated group of people. And yeah, this is going to take a little time to digest, I understand, and we won't be voting on it tomorrow. I know that. It's going to take some hearing and studying. The election code is complex. The little Bible that you get when you become an election official, it takes a while to digest it, to learn it. I guess probably one of the things I witnessed several years ago was the confusion over provisional ballots. There in Baldwin County, we have 3 colleges, and a lot of out-of-town students come to Milledgeville to college. And they all came in wanting to vote a provisional ballot. Well, we would find that they were registered in Cobb County or Gwinnett County, but they were not registered in Baldwin County. But they could not understand why they could not vote a provisional ballot in Baldwin County. I even had a political party person call me and threaten to sue me because I wouldn't let Gwinnett County students vote in Baldwin County. Well, it was 2:00 in the afternoon. They had time to go to Gwinnett County and vote. So there's confusion, and I hope and I feel like this is a step in the right direction. that gets all the counties and all the parties to understand and realize what elections are, how they're to be run, and the rules, and that everyone follows the rules and they're black and white. I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this committee, and I think we can all come together and realize that there's been some confusion, perceived as some of it real, some of it not. And we've got to work to get integrity and trust back into our election system. And I thank you for the opportunity to let me say a little that's on my heart. I know that a lot of hard work has gone in this draft, and I think we've got to move and we've got to do something. I think it's a move in the right direction. So I thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Chairman Smyrie.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I want to follow up with Representative Douglas. When we first started, we talked about it kind of like an ombudsman bill, and one that would be inclusive. And this does have everything in it. But my experience tells me that when you have a preamble, almost a full page that alludes itself to runoffs, general elections, filling vacancies, private funding, size of precincts, allocation of voting equipment, poll watcher training, provisional ballots, absentee ballots. It's a very comprehensive bill, but there's nothing more important fundamentally than a person's right and the privilege of voting. And I think something of this magnitude requires a lot of vetting. And our next election is in November of 22, which is almost 19 months from now. And I'm just trying to get the feel for the urgency of the matter. I know that we all hear from our constituents, and I appreciate that. There's one thing about me, I'm tolerant, and I have tolerance for others' opinions. And listen to all the members of this committee, they're listening to their constituents as I'm listening to mine. So I think that I'm just asking for some time for us to be able to look at this, digest it, and I'm just asking for a sense of fairness. That's all. I'm not asking anyone to agree with me from any perspective of anything that's in this bill. We're going to differ probably, but fundamentally, the right to vote is very, very precious. And from a historical perspective, we've climbed a mighty mountain, a mighty hill to get the right to vote. And I just cannot regress or abdicate that. I have to stand firm. And this is one area where I think we ought to really have some serious discussions and reach and look over beyond the political mountain and look at the fundamental rights of every citizen having the fairness and a right to vote, and do it in an environment that is fair to all. I don't think we ought to have anything that is an advantage as it relates to voting, but I think all the applications and everything that deals with voting ought to be applied equally and to everyone. And so that's how I kind of feel about this. I saw this today, but in terms of the process, I think this as Representative Douglas had alluded to earlier, this comes up under the aspect of looking at something that's very comprehensive and in an ombudsman way, and looking at everything from a higher altitude. I like to fly high. I don't like to fly at 10,000 feet. You might hit something and you can't see everything. So when I think and when I look at an issue like this, I like to get at 55,000 feet so I can see it, so I can see the whole aerial view comprehensively. And that's what voting is to me. You know, I've been in office 47 years, and I stand on the shoulders of people who gave their life for the right to vote. And I know history. I know history. And I'm just pleading that the final product, as we go through this process, there may be differences, and I can live with that. But all I want is a fair fight. That's all. I just want to be able to look at it, digest it, and have good, logical debate, and then go from there. But I think this is a step. Something like this is what I think you were asking for earlier. So I want to commend you for at least going to that process so that we can all see it in one bill, and this hits a lot of areas, and so that's my little food for thought. But I thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Burnough.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do agree that we should bring the election work supervisors down, but I don't think they'll be able to come tomorrow. So could we schedule them to maybe come on Monday? That gives us enough time to invite them. And then the other comment I just have is that I've been on this committee since I've been here when it was governmental affairs and I was on elections. And Fulton County is there's a lot of complaints about Fulton County. But Fulton County got themselves together. They came up with a bus, and now it's a problem. But they were creative, so their numbers came in on time. So I don't think that we should, if a county is improving, then let's at least congratulate them for that, but not to get mad because they thought of something that maybe somebody else didn't. My goal here is that Georgia will become a leader in elections, and that we're not going backwards, where every time you turn on the national news, they're talking about Georgia and our elections. Georgia is better than that. If we want to be the number one state to do business, we can be the number one state, and we should be forward thinking and trying to make sure that everybody here can vote, and to make sure that we are treating all Georgians the same way. And that's my goal. I want us to have fair elections and everybody to have opportunity to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Burnow. Any other comments or questions? Number 12, Chairman Martin.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I won't belabor the point's getting late. I do look forward to hearing from people, whether it be tomorrow, Friday. I mean, tomorrow is Friday and Monday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever it takes. I did want to answer the lady's questions. I am a person that represents Fulton County, and they did have the mobile units in Fulton County. Here's the issue with that. I mean, they came to my area. They were in other areas of the county. The issue was that is if you were on an email list, you knew where they were going to be. If you weren't, you didn't know. I made every effort, whether they were in areas that I represent in my district, I made efforts to promote that on social media. But the issue is one of uniformity with those mobile sites. Not every county can afford to have those out. And it gave people, I mean, again, they came into my district and people voted there. Some may have voted for me, some may have voted against, but people voted. But statewide, it's a uniformity issue, and not every place can afford them. And even in Fulton County, not everyone had equal access. So I think that's the reason I think we have to look at keeping things level and keeping a uniform relative to the mobile sites. Just wanted to bring that point, being someone that was familiar with what happened in Fulton. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Martin. Other comments from any members of the committee or any questions? All right. Representative Alexander. But your number, try again, go now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With this bill as huge as it is there a physical note with it? Or will there be a physical note with this?
No, ma'am. The size of the pages doesn't indicate whether or not it needs a physical
Well,
note. It's expenditure of state funds.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman, but
ma'am.
you mentioned about training,
Yes.
right? So I
Right.
would think that the counties are gonna have to pay for that, I'm assuming.
Since I've been knowledgeable of state election law, it is a shared process between the state and the counties. However, as some of the committee members probably know, it seems to be in Georgia, to me anyway, the counties actually play a bigger role in our elections process than I think they do in some other states. Some other states do have much more of a top-down system. So the cost of elections in Georgia has always been borne mostly by the counties. There are significant state expenditures. We have an election division in our executive branch of government that deals with many election issues, does provide significant training. In Georgia history, whenever we have purchased voting machines, the state has always stepped up and took care of that for the counties. However, after that initial purchase has taken place in the past, the counties themselves then, particularly the growing ones, fund their election system by addition of new machines and whatnot. My county, Columbia County, just 20 years ago when I was chairman of the county commission, we were less than 100,000 people. I think the guesstimates are after the next session will be 170,000 people. We were one of the counties that had to buy a lot of the old voting machines from different places. The general idea being is that most of the day-to-day activities, including training, is borne a good bit by the counties. But the state also plays some role in that. And of course, just like we have this process we're going through to change Georgia elections law, we have an appropriations process. And suggestions can be made and amendments can be proposed from anybody who serves on the appropriations committee for changes that they would like to see. And as you know, quite often the counties do come to us and ask for money for different things, because elections is not the only thing that we have a joint process that we fund together with the counties. So there's not a fiscal note on this because it doesn't involve a significant expenditure of state funds. But as you mentioned, changes do affect the counties, and there will be county expenditures. Now, I will say this to you. Several of the changes in this bill are meant to streamline, make more efficient the county election process of handling what they do. So on the one hand, we're trying to make it transparent and secure and fair, but we're also trying to streamline it. And that efficiency, I believe, will also help the counties in their pocketbooks. Thank you for your comment. Mr. Chairman, did you have another comment? Sure. Chairman Smyer has asked me to speak about the portion of the bill that deals with what is commonly referred to as jungle primaries. In Georgia right now, when we have a special election, generally speaking, we do not go through the primary and the runoff process. Many states do not have jungle primaries. South Carolina is right next door to me because I live in the Augusta area and we get a lot of South Carolina news. And whenever they have a vacancy, they do go through a primary process and a special election and a runoff if need be. And so you narrow down the people on the ballot, and in the final vote, there's usually not 18 folks or even 7 folks, depending on what kind of race it is. So what this bill does is it does eliminate that jungle or multiple candidates in a special election by reverting to a primary process. The only exceptions are the General Assembly and Congress. The reason, and not the Senate, but of course the House. The reason this bill makes those 2 exceptions, they are the 2 offices which cannot be filled by appointment. Now, why is that important? If right now your probate judge passes away or your sheriff resigns, there is a process in place for their their office not to be vacant, for the people to be served by someone putting in there. It varies, but sometimes the Superior Court judges replace the magistrate judge, for example, if that person is gone. Let's say at the state level, you have one of our constitutional statewide officers. We have seen in the past where the Secretary of State has resigned, or some other, the insurance commissioner, or some other office has resigned. We have in place a process to fill that seat until the next election. That is a gubernatorial appointment. Same way with judges for the most part, Superior Court, Appellate Court, Superior Court. The two places where our laws do not allow for appointment to fill a seat is the General Assembly and Congress. We know recently here in Atlanta, when Congressman Lewis passed away, the person who won his seat really only filled a month or two, I believe, after it was all said and done. But the reason we require that election is because nobody can appoint anybody to hold that seat for just even if a couple of months. Because of that need to get those seats filled, and the jungle primary process does move faster, we left that in place for those two areas. That's somewhat, in my mind, in keeping with current Georgia law. As you know from your experience here, and you've seen it happen many times, if a vacancy in the General Assembly occurs close to session or during session, the governor has to almost call what amounts to a snap election. 30 days, you have to have an election and have somebody there to fill that seat, the idea being we don't want it to be vacant. So that's why the bill gets rid of jungle primaries everywhere, but those two places where they can't otherwise be filled, Congress and the General Assembly.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
Hold on one second. Now go ahead. Go ahead now.
I appreciate that explanation, because that's one of the issues that I've had a lot of comment about as it relates to a lot of people going and do you vote twice? I mean, just how do you go forward in doing that? And I looked at some other states, and we had the 20 running at one time, so to speak. So I thank you for your explanation.
Absolutely. And you just touched on something that I also referenced earlier. You said people wondering how many times do they vote. You and I both know in city council races, for example, sometimes you can vote for more than one person.
That is correct.
And so when citizens go in and see that, I'll call it rare jungle primary, and in this past case, there were almost 20 folks running. I have heard of occasions where people voted for more than one person because, they heard two senators were up. Well, they were, but you didn't get to vote twice in that race. So it also, in my opinion, eliminates some confusion and makes the process work a little better.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. You're very welcome. Okay. Any additional comments, questions, or input from members of the committee? All right, if there is none, we've been at it for almost an hour and a half now. We do not have anyone that has signed up for this bill, do we? Okay, so the intent of the chair is, I believe the notice has gone out that we will meet at 9:30, is that right? 9:30 in the morning, and we'll be in 406 or 606? I think it's 406 tomorrow. 406 tomorrow morning at 9:30, we will meet, and we will spend a great deal of time discussing this and allowing witnesses to testify. If you have members of the committee, someone that you would like to testify, be sure and reach out to them. The notice went out to, golly, it must be, I don't know if it's a couple hundred, but it seems like a couple hundred people have asked to be notified of the meetings of this hearing. So that notice has gone out to dozens and dozens and dozens of folks. So unless there's any further comments or questions from members of the committee, Representative Burnough, did you have one?
Yes.
Go ahead.
If we are going to have a lot of people speaking tomorrow, will the state police be up here?
I will make that request for you,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
And will that be a hearing, Mr. Chairman, tomorrow?
It will certainly be a hearing. Whether or not somebody makes a motion, we'll see how tomorrow goes.
Okay, I'm trying to get a good night's rest, so I'm trying to sleep good, so we can not have a motion be made and let's get a good night's sleep. Let's don't, So I just say that for food for thought. Let's listen to the people tomorrow and get a good night's sleep. Let us go home over the weekend and watch a little TV and come back and then get into legislative business on Monday. That's what I'm hoping the committee would do.
Mr. Chairman, I've always taken your advice and really thought about it hard. And because you have asked for that, I will seriously consider it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the committee before we wrap it up? We will stand adjourned.